The photographs scattered across Raven's threadbare carpet like fallen leaves, each one a mirror reflecting her own face back at her. Different hair, different clothes, different decades, but the same sharp cheekbones, the same storm-gray eyes that had stared back at her from bathroom mirrors her entire life. Her hands shook as she picked up the first one. A young woman with honey-blonde hair smiled from what looked like a driver's license photo, the kind of generic DMV shot everyone hated. Someone had written Jennifer Walsh, Des Moines, 1987 in careful script across the back. The second showed a brunette at what might have been a graduation party, dated 1994 from Milwaukee. Then another from St. Louis, 1999. And another from Indianapolis, 2003. All missing. All her. The leather journal lay open beside her knees, her grandmother's spidery handwriting covering page after page in blue ink that had faded to gray. Raven's throat tightened as she recognized the careful loops and curves that had once written birthday cards and grocery lists, now documenting something far more sinister. March 15, 1996. Subject maintains pattern. Blonde hair, 5'6", early 20s. Always the eyes, though. Always those eyes. He's hunting the same ghost over and over. June 2nd, 1998. Found Jennifer's car abandoned outside Omaha. No body recovered. Police have stopped looking, but I can't. Not when I know what he's really after. December 20th, 2001. The pattern is accelerating. 3 this year alone, each one closer to Chicago, each one younger. He's getting impatient. Raven's vision blurred. She pressed her palm against her still flat stomach, where new life grew despite her body's protests of too little food and too much stress. The radiator clanged and wheezed in the corner, fighting a losing battle against February's bitter grip on the city. A creak from the hallway outside made her freeze. Mrs. Patterson from 3 Billions shuffling to the bathroom again, probably. The old woman had bladder problems and made the trip at least twice each night. But Raven found herself holding her breath anyway, listening to footsteps that seemed to pause just a little too long outside her door. She gathered the photographs with trembling fingers, studying each face that could have been her sister, her cousin, her twin. The journal revealed more with each page she turned. Meticulously documented travel routes, police reports her grandmother had somehow obtained, newspaper clippings about missing persons cases stretching back 30 years. September 8, 2003. Almost got him in Springfield. So close I could smell his cologne, something expensive, foreign, but he spotted the tail and vanished. Left behind another girl, though. Sarah Mitchell, age 19. Same build, same coloring, same eyes that look right through you. October 30th, 2003. Can't sleep. Keep thinking about the ones I didn't save. The ones he took before I understood what he was doing. Before I realized he wasn't just killing, he was searching, looking for something specific, someone specific. The handwriting changed on the next entry, became more urgent, less careful. November 12, 2003. Found her, found the original, the one he's been trying to recreate all these years. She's just a baby, maybe 6 months old. Dark hair that will lighten, eyes that will turn gray, bone structure that will break hearts and end lives if he ever finds her. The mother won't make it through the winter. Overdose or exposure, the streets will claim her either way. But the baby, I can save the baby. I can hide her. Raven's blood turned to ice water in her veins. The dates lined up perfectly with what she'd always known about her past, that her teenage mother had died when Raven was barely walking, that her grandmother had swooped in like an avenging angel to raise her in a tidy house on the north side, far from the chaos of the south side streets where she'd been born. November 15, 2003, brought her home today. She cried for 3 hours straight, then fell asleep in my arms like she'd always belonged there. I've named her Raven, for the darkness she'll help me bring to light, for the justice she doesn't know she represents. She'll never know what she really is, what she means to him, to me. I'll raise her safe and normal and loved, and maybe by the time she's grown, I'll have ended this. Maybe she'll never have to know why she can't sleep with her back to doors, or why strangers' stares make her skin crawl. But if something happens to me, If he finds us before I find him, I pray she'll be strong enough to finish what I started." The journal trembled in Raven's grip. Outside, wind howled between buildings like something wild and hungry, and she could swear she heard footsteps in the hallway again. Slower this time, more deliberate. She wasn't her grandmother's granddaughter. She was bait, and after 28 years, something told her the trap was finally ready to spring. The journal slipped from Raven's numb fingers, landing with a soft thud on the carpet beside the scattered photographs. She sat frozen in the pale wash of streetlight, filtering through her apartment's single window, her mind reeling as the words echoed in her skull: bait, trap, finish what I started. A door slammed somewhere in the building. Probably Martinez from 2A heading out for his graveyard shift at the warehouse. The sound jolted her back to the present, to the immediate reality of her situation. She was broke, pregnant, and apparently the target of a serial killer who'd been hunting girls who looked like her for 3 decades. Just another Tuesday night in paradise. Raven gathered the photographs with shaking hands, sliding them back into the hidden compartment along with the journal. Tomorrow she'd figure out what it all meant. Tonight she needed to focus on surviving until morning. The radiator's death rattle filled the silence as she pushed the dresser drawer closed, the hidden mechanism clicking back into place with an almost accusatory finality. Her phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, a text from Carlos at the garage where she picked up occasional work detailing bikes. "Got a custom Harley coming in Friday. Could use your touch. $200 if you can make her shine." $200. Not nearly enough to cover rent, but enough to keep the lights on for another month. Enough to buy prenatal vitamins and maybe some actual groceries instead of the gas station ramen that had sustained her for the past 2 weeks. She texted back a quick confirmation, already mentally cataloging which cleaning supplies she'd need to borrow. The baby fluttered in her stomach, barely a whisper of movement, but real enough to make her breath catch. 8 weeks along according to the free clinic's pregnancy test. Just a cluster of cells that would become a person who deserved better than this apartment, this life, this legacy of violence and secrets. Raven pressed her palm against her abdomen, remembering how her grandmother used to make her hot chocolate on nights when Chicago's winter felt too big and hungry. How she'd braid Raven's hair before school, fingers gentle but efficient, always checking the windows before they left the house, always watching. "I thought you were paranoid," Raven whispered to the empty room. "I thought you were just scared of your own shadow." But Evelyn Mackenzie hadn't been paranoid. She'd been vigilant. She'd been hunting. The floorboards creaked as Raven padded to the kitchenette, stepping over paint chips that had fallen from the ceiling sometime during the day. The refrigerator hummed a discordant tune, its contents sparse but organized with the precision of someone who'd learned to make every resource count. Leftover pizza from Tony's, where she waited tables 3 nights a week when they needed extra help. A carton of milk that would expire tomorrow. Hot sauce packets hoarded from various fast food runs. She'd worked her way out of the Iron Serpents 2 years ago, trading leather cuts and late-night runs for the mundane struggle of legitimate poverty. It had felt like victory then, like finally becoming the person her grandmother had believed she could be. Clean, safe, normal. Now normal felt like a lie. Clean felt like camouflage. Raven filled a chipped mug with tap water, the pipes groaning in protest. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Patterson's television murmuring something about tomorrow's weather. Chance of snow, temperatures dropping into single digits. The kind of cold that killed people who didn't have anywhere warm to sleep. The kind of cold that had probably killed her real mother, whoever she'd been. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call from Jade, her only real friend from the old days. The only serpent who'd understood why Raven needed to walk away. "You okay?" Jade's voice carried the scratchy undertone of someone who'd smoked too much, lived too hard. "You sound weird in your text earlier." "Define okay." Raven sank onto her thrift store couch, springs protesting under her weight. "I'm broke, pregnant, and probably getting evicted. But hey, at least I'm not in jail. Jesus, Ray. The baby thing, is it Marcus?" Marcus, 6'3" of charming mistake, who'd blown through her life like a summer storm. leaving behind empty beer bottles and false promises before disappearing back to Detroit. She'd been stupid enough to think his leather jacket and easy smile meant something more than a few good weeks. Yeah, not that it matters. He made his position pretty clear before he split. Jade was quiet for a moment, the sound of bar noise filtering through the connection. You know I got a spare room if things get too rough. It's not much, but it's warm. I can't. The words came out sharper than Raven intended. I mean, thanks, but I can't drag you into my mess. Especially now, she thought, glancing toward the dresser that held its terrible secrets. Not when I don't know who's watching. They talked for a few more minutes, Jade sharing gossip from the garage where they both worked, updating Raven on which serpents had found Jesus or jail or both. Normal conversation about an abnormal life, the kind of routine that had once felt like enough. Now it felt like borrowed time. After Jade hung up, Raven sat in the growing darkness, her phone's screen casting pale shadows across the walls. The silence felt different now, heavier, charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. She'd lived her entire adult life believing she was just another South Side success story, a girl who'd clawed her way out of gang colors and into something resembling respectability. Now she understood she'd never escaped anything. She'd been running toward a destination she didn't even know existed. The knock on her door came at 11:47 p.m. 3 soft raps, evenly spaced. Too polite to be her landlord demanding rent. Too late to be Mrs. Patterson borrowing sugar. Raven's blood froze in her veins as she stared at the peeling paint of her apartment door, every instinct her grandmother had drilled into her suddenly screaming at full volume. Never answer the door after dark. Never let strangers know you're home alone. Never trust anyone who smiles too much. Another knock, patient and persistent. Whoever stood in her hallway wasn't going away. Raven Mackenzie? A man's voice, cultured and smooth as aged whiskey. I apologize for the late hour, but I believe we need to talk. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, keeping her breathing shallow and quiet. Through the thin wood, she could hear him shifting his weight, the soft squeak of expensive leather shoes against worn linoleum. I knew your grandmother, the voice continued, and something in its tone made her skin crawl. Too friendly, too familiar. Evelyn was quite remarkable. We had such fascinating conversations over the years. Raven's mouth went dry. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, thumb hovering over 911. But what would she tell them? A man was talking to her through her door? That her dead grandmother might have been hunting serial killers? I know you found her little treasure trove tonight, he said, and her blood turned to Arctic water. The photographs, the journal, all those years of meticulous documentation. She really thought she was so clever. He's been watching. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He knows about the hidden drawer. He knows I found everything. The thing is, Raven, may I call you Raven? Your grandmother made a fundamental error in her calculations. She thought she was the hunter, but she was always just another player in a much larger game, a game that's finally reaching its conclusion. His voice never lost its pleasant, conversational tone. He could have been discussing the weather or asking directions to the nearest coffee shop. The casual normalcy of it made everything worse. I've been very patient, you understand. 28 years is a long time to wait for anything, but some prizes are worth the investment. Your grandmother prolonged things considerably, but in the end, she simply delayed the inevitable. Raven pressed her back harder against the wall, her free hand instinctively protecting her stomach. The baby, barely the size of a grape, but already more important than her own life. Whatever this man wanted, whatever game he thought he was playing, it couldn't touch her child. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered to her reflection in the black window. Not without a fight. You have a choice to make, the man continued, apparently content to conduct his side of the conversation through the door. You can open this door and we can discuss your situation like civilized adults. Or you can make this difficult, and I'll simply wait until you have to leave. For work, for food, for that doctor's appointment you've been putting off. Her breath caught. He knew about the pregnancy. He knew about her schedule, her routines, the careful architecture of her struggling life. You see, I've learned from past mistakes. Your grandmother taught me the value of patience, of thorough preparation. I know about your friend Jade, about Carlos at the garage, about Mrs. Patterson's weak heart and her grandson who visits every other Sunday. I know about the iron serpents, about Marcus, about every choice you've made since you turned 18. The phone trembled in her grip. Speed dial for Jade, for Carlos, for anyone who might come running if she screamed loud enough. But he'd just told her he knew about all of them. How many people was she willing to drag into danger? The remarkable thing, he continued, is how perfectly you've developed. Even better than I'd hoped. The bone structure, the coloring, that particular shade of defiance in your eyes. It's all exactly right. Your grandmother chose well when she stole you. Stole. Not saved, not rescued. Stole. I'm going to walk away now, he said, and she heard the soft whisper of movement in the hallway. But I'll be back tomorrow. Night. Same time. And you're going to open the door, Raven, because by then you'll understand that you don't really have any other choice. His footsteps faded down the hallway, impossibly quiet for such an ominous presence. A door opened and closed somewhere below, the building's front entrance probably. Raven remained frozen against the wall, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The ordinary world, her struggles with rent and pregnancy and loneliness, felt like ancient history now. The real game was just beginning. Raven stayed pressed against the wall for what felt like hours, listening to the building's familiar symphony of creaks and sighs. Every sound made her flinch. The radiator's death rattle, Mrs. Patterson's muffled television, the distant rumble of late-night traffic on Western Avenue. When her legs finally gave out, she slid down to the floor, knees drawn to her chest like armor against the world. Tomorrow night. Same time. The words circled her mind like vultures. 24 hours to figure out what the hell she was supposed to do with information that felt too big, too dangerous, too impossible to process. Her grandmother, the woman who'd taught her to braid her hair and balance a checkbook and never trust anyone completely, had been hunting a serial killer, had stolen her from whatever life she'd been born into and used her as bait in some elaborate trap that had taken 3 decades to spring. Raven pressed her palm against her stomach, where cells divided and multiplied in blissful ignorance of the chaos surrounding them. The baby would be due in October, when Chicago's autumn painted the trees gold and red before winter stripped them bare. She'd imagined teaching her child to ride bikes in Lincoln Park, to navigate the L system, to avoid the mistakes that had defined her own youth. Simple dreams, normal dreams. Now she couldn't even guarantee they'd survive the week. Her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord. Rent was due 3 days ago. Pay up by Friday or start packing. Raven almost laughed at the absurdity. Eviction seemed quaint compared to whatever game that smooth-voiced stranger was playing. But the threat was still real, still immediate. If she didn't come up with $1,200 by Friday, she'd be homeless. Pregnant and homeless in February, when the streets killed more efficiently than any serial killer. The dresser. The thought hit her like a physical blow. The ornate Victorian piece that dominated her tiny apartment, that held her grandmother's secrets in hidden drawers and false bottoms. It was worth at least 2 months' rent, maybe 3. Carlos had mentioned knowing a collector who'd pay cash for authentic antiques, no questions asked. She could sell it. Take the money and run. Leave Chicago tonight, before tomorrow's deadline, before whatever plan that man had set in motion could unfold. Start over somewhere warm and anonymous, where pregnant waitresses were just another struggling demographic instead of pawns in deadly games. But selling the dresser meant abandoning the only real clues she had about her past. It meant never knowing who her birth mother had been, or why a killer had spent 3 decades searching for girls who looked like her. It meant accepting that she was exactly what that voice in the hallway had called her, stolen goods, finally ready for collection. Coward. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from the shadows. I didn't raise you to run from fights. Except Evelyn hadn't raised her granddaughter. She'd raised someone else's child, someone she'd taken from a dying drug addict and molded into a weapon she'd never had the chance to use. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee kissed better. Every stern lecture about staying away from the wrong crowd, it had all been preparation for a war Raven hadn't known she was enlisted in. The betrayal felt worse than Marcus walking away. Worse than discovering the pregnancy alone in a gas station bathroom. Worse than watching her savings evaporate as Chicago's winter stretched on like a punishment from an Old Testament God. 28 years of lies. But underneath the anger, something else stirred, something that felt dangerously like curiosity. Those photographs. All those girls who could have been her sisters, her twins, her alternate selves. They'd had families too, probably. People who'd loved them and lost them and never gotten answers. Her grandmother's journal documented their disappearances with the clinical precision of someone who'd made their tragedy into purpose. What if running meant more girls would die? What if whatever plan Evelyn Mackenzie had spent 30 years crafting could still work, could still bring justice to women whose names had been forgotten by everyone except a killer and his obsessed pursuer? Raven hauled herself off the floor and walked to the window, peering through dirty glass at the street below. A homeless man pushed a shopping cart past the broken streetlight, bundled in layers that wouldn't be enough when the temperature dropped below zero tomorrow night. A patrol car cruised slowly down Western, its occupants probably counting the hours until their shift ended and they could go home to warm houses and normal problems. Normal looked like paradise from her side of the glass. But normal had never really been an option, had it? Not for stolen children raised as bait, not for girls whose faces matched a killer's obsession, not for women who carried the ghosts of their grandmother's unfinished business in hidden drawers and faded photographs. Tomorrow night. Same time? Raven touched her stomach one more time, feeling for movement that wouldn't come for weeks yet. Whatever choice she made would belong to both of them now, mother and child, hunter and hunted, the last players in a game that had started before she was born. She just wasn't sure she was brave enough to play. The decision crystallized at 3:17 a.m., when exhaustion finally dragged Raven into fitful sleep and nightmares filled with girls who had her face. She woke with the taste of copper in her mouth and her grandmother's voice echoing in her ears. Some fights choose you, baby girl. The only shame is in pretending they don't. Dawn crept through her windows like an apology, pale and hesitant. Raven made instant coffee with shaking hands, the routine automatic while her mind cataloged everything she needed to do before darkness fell again. The baby fluttered, barely a whisper of movement, but enough to remind her that this choice belonged to more than just herself. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her unborn child. "I'm so damn sorry," but she was going to do it anyway. By noon, Raven had withdrawn her last $87 from the ATM on Ashland Avenue, her bank account now a perfect zero. The cash felt thin and insufficient in her jacket pocket, but it was enough for what she needed. At Gomez Surplus, she bought a digital recorder small enough to hide in her palm, its battery life guaranteed for 6 hours. At the hardware store 3 blocks down, she purchased a small hammer and a screwdriver set, tools that would fit in her boots if she wore them loose enough. The gun was harder. "You sure about this, Ray?" Carlos asked, his weathered hands steady on the Glock 19 he'd pulled from beneath his workbench. The garage smelled of motor oil and old cigarettes, familiar scents that had once meant safety. "This ain't exactly your style anymore. My style's about to get me killed." She tested the weapon's weight, muscle memory from her Iron Serpent's days flooding back unbidden. 2 years of legitimate living hadn't erased the skills her grandmother had insisted she learn. "A woman alone needs teeth," Evelyn had said. "Pretty ones if possible, but sharp either way. You want to tell me what kind of trouble you're in?" Raven met his concerned gaze, seeing genuine affection there. Carlos had given her work when no one else would hire an ex-gang member, had never asked questions about the scars on her knuckles or why she flinched when men got too close too quickly. He deserved better than being dragged into whatever web she'd inherited. "The kind that spreads," she said finally. "The less you know, the safer you are." He handed her a box of ammunition with obvious reluctance. "You need backup. You call me. Don't matter what time, don't matter what kind of mess. Family takes care of family." The word family hit harder than it should have. Raven pocketed the gun and bullets, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't afford. "I know. And Carlos? If something happens to me, if I just disappear, There's information hidden in my grandmother's dresser. Someone should know about it. She left before he could ask more questions, before the temptation to confess everything became too strong. The L train carried her back toward her apartment through the gray afternoon, past neighborhoods where normal people lived normal lives in blissful ignorance of the predators that hunted in their shadows. At 4 p.m., Raven called her landlord and lied about having his money, buying herself another few days. At 4:30, she texted Jade to cancel their weekend plans, offering no explanation. At 5 p.m., she sat on her couch and reread every page of her grandmother's journal, memorizing details about the women who'd vanished, about patterns only Evelyn had been patient enough to trace. Sarah Kellerman, 19, vanished from a truck stop outside Rockford, last seen arguing with a man in an expensive suit who bought her coffee and claimed to know her mother. Michelle Torres, 23, disappeared from her apartment in Milwaukee. Neighbors reported seeing a well-dressed stranger in the hallway, asking questions about her schedule. Jennifer Walsh, 20, never came home from her waitressing job in Des Moines. Security footage showed her getting into a dark sedan with a man her co-workers described as charming and polite. 27 women over 30 years. All young, all struggling, all bearing variations of the same features that stared back at Raven from her bathroom mirror. Her grandmother had tracked their disappearances with the dedication of a scholar, documenting every detail, every connection, every near miss with local law enforcement who'd written them off as runaways or prostitutes who'd moved on to greener pastures. But Evelyn had seen the pattern, had understood what others missed or chose to ignore, had stolen one more girl, a baby whose drug-addicted mother wouldn't be missed, and raised her as both daughter and weapon. The trap was always supposed to be me. As evening approached, Raven positioned the tiny recorder in her jacket pocket, checked the gun tucked into her waistband, and tried to remember how to pray. The apartment felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in to match the narrowing of her choices. Outside, Chicago's winter darkness gathered like a living thing, patient and hungry. She was done running from her inheritance, done pretending she could be normal when normal had never been an option. Her grandmother had spent 3 decades preparing for this moment, training her unwitting weapon with bedtime stories about brave girls who faced down monsters. Tonight, Raven would finally become the woman Evelyn Mackenzie had shaped her to be. The monster was coming. She'd be ready. Tests and allies. At 8:47 p.m., 3 minutes before the appointed time, Raven's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, 3rd floor. Fire escape. Come alone. Her blood turned to slush. He wasn't coming to her door. He was already inside the building, had found another way in, was changing the rules of his own game. The fire escape led to the alley behind her building, a narrow concrete canyon where screams would echo off brick walls before dying in the winter wind. This is it. The recording device felt suddenly inadequate in her pocket, a child's toy against a predator who'd been perfecting his craft since before she was born. But she pressed the record button anyway, then typed a quick text to Carlos, "If you don't hear from me by midnight, call the cops." Check the dresser. She sent it without allowing herself to reconsider. The hallway stretched endlessly toward the fire escape door, each step echoing like gunshots in the silence. Mrs. Patterson's television murmured behind her door, some late-night talk show where normal people discussed normal problems. Raven envied them so fiercely it felt like physical pain. The fire escape door stood slightly ajar, winter air seeping through the gap like fingers testing for weakness. Beyond it, metal stairs descended into darkness punctuated by the distant glow of streetlights. She pushed the door open and stepped into the cold, her breath clouding immediately. "Punctual," came the voice from below. "Your grandmother taught you well." He stood on the second-floor landing, barely visible in the shadows between buildings. Average height, expensive coat, face obscured by the darkness he'd chosen so carefully. Just another well-dressed man who could disappear into any crowd, any office building, any upscale restaurant where lonely young women served coffee to polite strangers. "What do you want?" Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, carrying the edge she'd learned in Iron Serpent's territory, where showing fear meant becoming prey. What I've always wanted. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. What I was promised 28 years ago before your grandmother decided to play hero. The gun pressed against her spine, solid and reassuring. 3 more steps and he'd be close enough. 2 more steps and she could see his face clearly. Angular features, graying temples, eyes that reflected the distant streetlight like an animal's. She stole me from my mother. The words came out flat, factual, a drug addict who was dying anyway. Stole you from. His smile was gentle, fatherly, the expression of someone explaining simple math to a slow child. Your mother was an acquisition, temporary. She served her purpose when she gave birth to exactly what I'd been searching for. 1 more step. Close enough now to smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that would linger on fabric, on skin, in the last moments before darkness. All those other girls, Raven said. They were practice. They were disappointments. His voice carried genuine sadness, as if he mourned the women he'd murdered. Close, but never quite right. Your bone structure, though, the way your eyes catch the light, the precise angle of your cheekbone, it's perfect. It's exactly what I've been waiting for. And my grandmother knew. Evelyn understood the inevitable. She simply delayed it, turned you into something harder to claim. But even she couldn't change what you are, Raven. What you've always been. Which is what? His smile widened. Mine. The word hung between them like a blade. Below, a car door slammed, and footsteps echoed in the alley, heavy boots moving fast. The man's expression shifted slightly, annoyance flickering across his features. Expecting company? He asked mildly. Carlos. The voice from below was rough with cigarettes and concern. Ray, you up there? Shit. She hadn't expected him to come himself, hadn't wanted anyone else in the crossfire. But his presence changed everything, gave her leverage, options, the possibility that someone might survive to tell the story. Your mechanic friend, the man observed. How predictable. People like you always involve others, never understanding that their concern only creates more opportunities for loss. He reached into his coat with practiced casualness, and Raven saw the flash of metal, the familiar outline of a weapon much more sophisticated than hers. Here's what's going to happen, he continued, his voice still conversational. You're going to tell him you're fine, that you'll see him tomorrow. And then you're going to come with me, quietly and without fuss, because if you don't, I'm going to put a bullet in his head and take you anyway. Raven! Carlos called again. Closer now, probably at the base of the fire escape. The man waited, gun steady, expression patient. 28 years of patience, she realized. What was another few minutes? But as his attention flickered toward the alley below, Raven saw something that made her breath catch. Another figure moving in the shadows across the street. A woman with silver hair and a purposeful stride, approaching the building's front entrance. Mrs. Patterson, out past her usual bedtime, moving with unexpected determination. The trap wasn't just for her, Raven realized. It was for him, and it was finally springing. The pieces clicked together with crystalline clarity. Mrs. Patterson wasn't just a nosy neighbor who watched too much television and knew everyone's business. She was moving through the shadows with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before, her silver hair catching streetlight as she positioned herself at the building's entrance. She's been watching him, watch me. I'm fine, Carlos, Raven called down, her voice carrying just enough tremor to sound authentic while her mind raced. Just getting some air. Go on home. The man's smile returned, pleased with her compliance, but his gun remained steady. Smart girl. Your grandmother did teach you. She taught me that some monsters hide behind manners, Raven interrupted, taking a half step closer. That the politest ones are usually the most dangerous. Is that what she told you about me? His laugh was soft, genuinely amused. How delightfully backward. Evelyn was the monster, dear. I simply appreciate beauty in its proper form. Below, Carlos's footsteps paused. then started up the fire escape despite her dismissal. The metal stairs groaned under his weight, each clang echoing off the brick walls like a countdown timer. "Call him off," the man said, his pleasant tone unchanged even as his finger moved to the trigger. "Or this ends badly for everyone." But Raven was watching Mrs. Patterson's approach, seeing how the older woman moved with deliberate purpose toward the building's front door. She had keys. Of course she had keys. How long had she been Evelyn's partner in this? How many years had she spent in the apartment next door, listening through thin walls, waiting for this moment? "You know what I think," Raven said, loud enough for her voice to carry down the fire escape. "I think you're scared." The man's composure cracked slightly. Scared of what, exactly? Of the trap closing. She took another step, close enough now to see the surprise flicker across his features. 30 years you've been hunting girls who look like me, and you never wondered why my grandmother kept me right here? Right where you could find me? Ray?" Carlos called from directly below. "Everything okay up there?" "Because she wasn't protecting me from you," Raven continued, her voice gaining strength. "She was protecting you from me." The lie felt dangerous and necessary, a bluff that might buy her seconds or get them all killed. But something in her grandmother's journal had nagged at her, pages that seemed too clinical, too removed, as if Evelyn had been documenting more than just a killer's pattern, as if she'd been studying his methods for a reason. The man's gun wavered slightly. Evelyn was a retired librarian who read too many mystery novels. Evelyn was a lot of things. Mrs. Patterson's voice drifted up from the alley, calm and clear. She'd made it inside the building, but retiring was never one of them. The man spun toward the sound, his careful positioning suddenly compromised. Raven saw her chance and took it, lunging forward as her hand closed around the gun at her back. But 28 years of patience had made him fast, and he moved with her, his weapon swinging back toward Carlos's approaching footsteps. "Enough games," he snarled, the polite mask finally slipping. "You're coming with me, and anyone who tries to stop that is going to—" The building's lights went out. Every window went dark simultaneously. Not a power outage, but something deliberate and coordinated. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, casting everything in hellish red shadows that turned the fire escape into a scene from a nightmare. "Now, Raven," Mrs. Patterson's voice carried from inside the building, sharp with authority. But the man was already moving, years of experience taking over as he grabbed Raven's wrist and pressed his gun against her temple. "Very clever," he called into the darkness. "But I've been planning this longer than you've been alive, Mrs. Patterson. Did you really think theatrical lighting would—" The fire escape door above them crashed open, and Carlos burst through with the controlled violence of someone who'd learned to fight in places where losing meant dying. His work-scarred fist connected with the man's jaw in a blow that sent them all staggering against the railing. The gun went off. The sound was deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flash strobing against brick walls. Raven felt the bullet's heat as it passed inches from her ear. Then Carlos was wrestling with the man while she scrambled for the weapon that had clattered onto the metal grating. "Get inside," Carlos grunted, taking an elbow to the ribs that doubled him over. "Get the hell inside!" But Raven's fingers closed around cold metal, and when she came up with the gun, her grandmother's training took over. 28 years of bedtime stories about brave girls who faced down monsters. 28 years of preparation for exactly this moment. "Stop," she said quietly. Both men froze, Carlos's hand still locked around the killer's throat. "Step away, Carlos." He looked at her, saw something in her face that made him obey without question. The man straightened slowly, blood trickling from his split lip, his expensive coat torn, but his eyes held no fear. Only the patient hunger of someone who'd waited 3 decades and could wait a little longer. "What now, little girl?" he asked. "Are you going to shoot me?" Raven's hands were steady as stone. "That depends," she said, "on what you know about my real mother." The man's smile returned despite the blood on his lips, as if her question had somehow pleased him. In the hellish red glow of the emergency lighting, his face looked carved from shadows and malice. "Your real mother," he repeated, savoring the words. "Maria Santos. 19 years old. beautiful in that fragile way that some men find irresistible. She danced at a club in Gary, Indiana. Nothing elegant, just survival dressed up in sequins and desperation. Raven's finger tightened on the trigger, but she forced herself to stay silent. Below them, Mrs. Patterson's footsteps echoed in the stairwell, measured and purposeful. Whatever plan her grandmother had set in motion was still unfolding. Maria thought she was so clever, he continued, his voice taking on the dreamy quality of someone lost in cherished memories. When she realized what I wanted from her, she tried to run. Made it all the way to Detroit before I found her again. By then, of course, she was showing. Showing what? But Raven already knew. The cold certainty of it settled in her stomach like swallowed glass. Pregnant with you, my dear. The perfect combination of her bone structure and whatever worthless DNA the father contributed. I kept her comfortable during those final months. A nice apartment, good food, prenatal vitamins. I wanted you to be healthy. Carlos made a sound like a wounded animal, his hands clenching into fists. You sick piece of... She died in childbirth, the man continued, ignoring the interruption. Complications, the doctor said. But I had what I needed. A perfect specimen, unmarked by the world's disappointments. At least, that was the plan. Until my grandmother interfered. Raven's voice came out flat, emotionless. She couldn't afford to feel anything yet. Not rage, not grief, not the terrible understanding of exactly what she'd been created for. Evelyn worked at the hospital, he said. Some insignificant administrative position that gave her access to records, to information about which babies might disappear without causing too much fuss. She was supposed to facilitate the adoption. Instead, she took you and vanished. The fire escape creaked under their weight as wind gusted through the alley. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. Whether coming toward them or responding to some other emergency, Raven couldn't tell. For 28 years, I searched, following rumors, chasing leads, always one step behind Evelyn's paranoid precautions. She moved you constantly those first few years. Different cities, different names, always watching for any sign that I'd found your trail. But you did find us. The pieces were clicking together now, forming a picture more terrible than anything in her grandmother's journal. That's why we settled in Chicago. That's why she stopped running. She was dying, he said simply. Cancer, though she hid it well those final years and she knew I was close, had been closing in ever since you turned 18 and started leaving traces the internet never forgets. Social media accounts, employment records. That delightfully public arrest when you were running with those motorcycle enthusiasts. The Iron Serpents. Of course. Her stint with the gang had put her name in police databases, created a digital footprint that someone patient and resourceful could follow. Every choice she'd made, every attempt to build a normal life, had been breadcrumbs leading him straight to her door. So she made a choice, Raven said. She stopped running and started preparing. She turned you into bait, he agreed. But also into something more dangerous than she'd intended. All that training, all those stories about brave girls fighting monsters, she was programming you to fight back when the moment came. Unfortunately for both of you, I've had 30 years to evolve beyond the man she thought she understood. The building's front door opened somewhere below them, and Mrs. Patterson's voice drifted up through the darkness. Building secure. No other exits. Other exits, as if they were containing something instead of being trapped themselves. Your neighbor thinks this is some kind of elaborate snare, the man said, amusement coloring his tone. She believes your grandmother left behind contingency plans, safety measures, ways to turn the tables on the big bad wolf. How touchingly naive. But even as he spoke, Raven caught something in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. He was talking too much, explaining too much, as if trying to convince himself as much as her. You're scared, she realized. All this time, and you still don't know what she was really planning. I'm cautious, he corrected. Caution is what's kept me alive and free, while lesser predators rotted in prison cells or shallow graves. No, Raven said, taking a step closer despite the gun in his hand. You're terrified, because for the first time in 30 years, you're not in control. The man's composure cracked further. I have the weapon. I have the experience. I have nothing. Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the darkness from directly below them now, calm and certain. You have nothing, Dr. Marcus Webb. And it's time you understood exactly how long we've been waiting for you. The name hit him like a physical blow. In 30 years of careful anonymity, someone had finally spoken his real name. And Raven smiled. The moment Mrs. Patterson spoke his real name, everything changed. Dr. Marcus Webb's face went white beneath the emergency lighting. 30 years of careful anonymity shattered in an instant. But his reaction wasn't just surprise, it was recognition. The kind that comes when a trap you've sensed but couldn't see finally reveals itself. Impossible, he whispered. That name is buried. Records destroyed, colleagues dead, entire institutions. Burned down? Mrs. Patterson's voice carried up from the stairwell, getting closer. Yes, we know about the psychiatric hospital, about your early experiments, about the patients who disappeared from your care before anyone thought to look for patterns. Raven felt the world tilting beneath her feet. The man who'd been hunting her wasn't just a serial killer. He was a doctor, someone who'd once taken oaths to heal, to protect, to do no harm. The Brookfield Institute, Webb said slowly, his gun still trained on her but his attention fragmenting. That fire was ruled accidental. Evelyn was very thorough, Mrs. Patterson replied. She spent years documenting everything before she decided the only way to stop you was to burn it all down. The hospital, the records, the evidence of what you'd been doing to those girls in the name of research. Research. The word hit Raven like ice water. She thought of the photographs in the hidden drawer, all those missing women who looked like her. Not just victims, subjects. My grandmother burned down a hospital? She breathed. She burned down a house of horrors, Webb corrected, and there was genuine anger in his voice now. Years of groundbreaking work, irreplaceable data. She destroyed it all because she couldn't understand the significance of what I was achieving. You were torturing women, Carlos snarled from where he stood against the railing. I was studying perfection, Webb snapped. Mapping the precise combination of features that represents the absolute peak of human beauty. Do you have any idea how rare it is? The exact angle of cheekbone, the specific spacing of eyes, the proportions that trigger something primal in the human brain? Raven's stomach churned as understanding crashed over her. You weren't just killing them, you were measuring them, documenting them, preserving them, creating a catalog of beauty that could have advanced our understanding of aesthetics, of attraction, of the very mechanisms that drive human behavior. His voice carried the fervor of a true believer, someone who'd convinced himself that atrocity was enlightenment. And then you found my mother, Raven said quietly. Maria was close, so close to perfect. But she was damaged. Drugs, poor nutrition, the kind of rough living that leaves marks on bone structure. I realized I needed to work with better raw materials. So, you got her pregnant. Webb's smile returned, proud and paternal. I gave her purpose. And when you were born, I knew I'd finally achieved it. The perfect specimen, unmarked, ready to be preserved at the exact moment of ideal development. She would have been 28 this year, Mrs. Patterson said, and Raven could hear her climbing the stairs now, getting closer to their floor. The age you've always taken them. The age Maria would have been when you killed her. But as the older woman spoke, Raven caught something else, a sound from below that made her blood freeze. More footsteps in the building, but these were different. Heavier, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Webb heard it too, and his expression shifted from anger to something like satisfaction. You thought you were so clever, he said to Mrs. Patterson, though his gun remained on Raven. Setting up your little ambush, cutting the power, making me feel trapped. But I've had 30 years to plan for every contingency, including nosy neighbors who think they understand the game they're playing. No, Raven whispered as the footsteps reached their floor. You didn't come alone. I never work alone anymore. Too many variables, too many ways for idealistic old women to interfere with necessary work. Webb's voice carried cold satisfaction. My associates are quite efficient. Mrs. Patterson will be joining us shortly. though I'm afraid her participation will be significantly less voluntary than she'd hoped. The stairwell door below them burst open, and men in dark clothing poured onto the fire escape. Not police, Raven could tell that immediately from the way they moved, the weapons they carried, the coordinated silence of their approach. Carlos lunged for Webb, but one of the newcomers was already there, a taser crackling in his hand. Carlos convulsed and dropped, his body hitting the metal grating with a sickening thud. No! Raven swung her gun toward the man with the taser, but Webb's hand closed over her wrist like a vice. "Careful, my dear," he murmured. "We wouldn't want you damaged before we reach the studio." As his associates secured Carlos with zip ties and moved toward the building to collect Mrs. Patterson, Raven realized the terrible truth. Her grandmother's 30-year plan hadn't just failed. It had delivered her directly into the monster's hands. Webb's grip on her wrist was iron, but Raven's mind raced as his associates moved through the building like a coordinated machine. 30 years. He'd had 30 years to plan for this moment, to anticipate every move her grandmother might have made. But as the emergency lights cast everything in hellish red shadows, something nagged at her, a detail that didn't fit. "You're lying," she said suddenly. Webb's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. "About what, my dear?" "About my grandmother burning down the hospital. About destroying your work." The pieces were clicking together now, forming a picture that made her stomach lurch. She didn't destroy anything. She took it. For the first time since he'd appeared on the fire escape, Webb's composure cracked completely. The hand holding her wrist trembled almost imperceptibly, and his pale eyes went wide with something approaching panic. "Impossible. I saw the ashes, read the reports. Everything was—" "The photographs," Raven pressed, her voice gaining strength as the terrible understanding crystallized. "In the hidden drawer. They weren't copies you made. They were originals from your files. She stole your research before she burned the building." Below them, Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the darkness with surgical precision. 30 years worth of documentation, Marcus. Every victim, every measurement, every sick note you made about your subjects, all of it sitting in that dresser, waiting for the right moment. Webb's gun hand was shaking now, his careful control unraveling as the scope of his miscalculation became clear. She couldn't have. The security systems, the safeguards. She was a librarian, Raven said, and despite everything, she felt a surge of fierce pride. She understood information systems better than anyone, and she had access to the hospital records, remember? Including the security protocols. "But the drawer was locked," Webb whispered, more to himself than to her. "I've been watching the building for weeks, waiting for you to find it. The mechanism only responds to specific pressure points. A combination that—" He stopped, his face going ashen as the final piece fell into place. "A combination that what?" Raven demanded. Mrs. Patterson answered from the darkness below, "That only activates when someone with your exact bone structure touches the right spots. Evelyn spent 2 years modifying that locking mechanism, calibrating it to your specific measurements. The drawer wouldn't open for anyone else." The revelation hit Raven like a physical blow. Her grandmother hadn't just hidden the evidence, she'd created a lock that turned Raven herself into the key. Every bedtime story about brave girls, every self-defense lesson, every warning about staying alert, it had all been preparation for this moment. Not to run from the monster, but to become the weapon that would finally stop him. "She turned me into bait," Raven breathed. "But not for you, for this, for the moment when you'd come for me and find 30 years of evidence waiting." Webb's associates had gone silent below them, and Raven realized they were listening. Whatever loyalty they had to him was based on his competence, his careful planning, his reputation for never leaving loose ends. But a man who'd been outmaneuvered by a dead librarian was something different entirely. "The journal," she continued, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Everything you told those women before you killed them, every detail about your research, your methods, your real identity. She documented all of it." "No," Webb said, but the word came out hollow. "I was careful. I never used names, never left—" "You bragged," Mrs. Patterson interrupted. "Evelyn interviewed the survivors from Brookfield, the patients who escaped before the fire. You couldn't resist explaining your theories to your victims, could you? Couldn't resist letting them understand the significance of what was happening to them. Raven felt the man's grip loosening as the weight of exposure settled on him. For 3 decades, he'd been a ghost, a rumor, a pattern that law enforcement could sense but never prove. But her grandmother had built something more damning than any police investigation, a complete record of his crimes locked away until the moment he'd inevitably come for the one victim who'd escaped. "She knew you'd find me eventually," Raven said, understanding flooding through her. "And she knew that when you did, you'd be so focused on finishing what you started that you wouldn't see the trap until it was too late." Webb's gun wavered, then slowly lowered. Around them, his associates shifted nervously. Professional killers suddenly uncertain about their employer's competence. In the distance, sirens were definitely getting closer now, not approaching some other emergency, but converging on this building with the precision of a coordinated response. The evidence isn't just in the drawer, Raven realized with growing amazement. Mrs. Patterson already copied it, already sent it to the FBI, the Chicago PD, 3 major newspapers, and a documentary filmmaker who's been investigating cold cases in the Midwest, Mrs. Patterson confirmed. As of 20 minutes ago, when you found that hidden drawer, every detail of Dr. Marcus Webb's career became public record. Webb stared at Raven with something approaching awe, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as prey, not as a research subject, but as the culmination of a plan that had been 30 years in the making. "She really did it," he whispered. "The brilliant, vindictive old bitch really did it." And Raven smiled. The sirens were no longer distant. They were here, surrounding the building with the coordinated precision of a federal task force. Webb's associates exchanged glances that spoke volumes about shifting loyalties and self-preservation instincts. "Drop your weapons," came the amplified voice from below. "This is the FBI. The building is surrounded." Webb's gun clattered to the fire escape grating. His carefully constructed world of shadows and anonymity was collapsing in real time, 30 years of meticulous planning undone by a dead woman's patience and foresight. But as the chaos swirled around them, Raven felt something unexpected rising in her chest, not relief, but raw, blazing anger. "You killed my mother," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of approaching federal agents. "You murdered dozens of women, and you were going to kill me and my baby." Webb looked up at her with eyes that had gone completely empty. "Your baby?" The question caught her off guard. In all the revelations about research and documentation, she'd forgotten that he didn't know about her pregnancy. The life growing inside her, the future that her grandmother had died protecting. "That's right," she said, placing her free hand protectively over her stomach. "Your perfect specimen is going to be a mother. How's that for ruining your research?" For a moment, something flickered in Webb's expression that might have been human emotion. Disappointment, perhaps, or genuine confusion at this deviation from his carefully constructed narrative. "The chain breaks with me," Raven continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Whatever sick legacy you thought you were creating, whatever pattern you've been following, it ends now." Mrs. Patterson emerged from the stairwell, flanked by FBI agents in tactical gear. The older woman looked remarkably composed for someone who just orchestrated the capture of a serial killer. But Raven caught the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of adrenaline and 30 years of careful preparation finally reaching its conclusion. "Are you hurt?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her eyes scanning Raven for injuries. "No," Raven replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. The physical wounds would heal, but the psychological impact of learning she'd been designed as prey, raised as bait, and transformed into a weapon was something she'd be processing for years. Carlos groaned from where he lay zip-tied on the grating, slowly regaining consciousness from the taser hit. One of the FBI agents was already cutting his restraints and checking his vitals. "Ma'am, we need you to step away from the suspect," an agent said to Raven, his tone professionally gentle but firm. She looked down at Webb, this man who'd shaped her entire existence without her knowledge. He seemed smaller now, diminished by exposure and the weight of inevitable justice, just another aging predator who'd finally run out of shadows to hide in. 30 years, she said to him. You spent 30 years hunting me, but you never understood what you were really chasing." Webb's head tilted slightly, a ghost of his earlier curiosity returning. "You thought I was your masterpiece," Raven continued. "But I was never yours. I was hers. Every lesson she taught me, every story she told me, every moment she spent preparing me for this, that was love. Real love. Something you'll never understand because you're incapable of seeing people as anything more than objects." The FBI agents moved in to secure Webb, but he didn't resist. He seemed almost relieved to finally shed the weight of his long hunt. As they led him away in handcuffs, Raven felt something shift inside her chest. The fear that had been her constant companion since finding the hidden drawer was transforming into something else, determination. "Mrs. Patterson," she called as the older woman prepared to give her statement to the federal agents. The money in the drawer was that part of her plan too? Mrs. Patterson smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it reached her eyes. Evelyn was very practical. She knew that justice was important, but so was making sure you could build a real life afterward. That money isn't evidence, it's inheritance. Your grandmother's way of ensuring you and your baby have choices. Choices. The word felt foreign after days of feeling trapped by circumstances and revelations beyond her control. But as Raven placed both hands protectively over her growing child, she realized that her grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the trap that caught Webb or the money that would secure her future. It had been the strength to survive this moment and emerge whole on the other side. "Thank you," she said to Mrs. Patterson, though the words felt inadequate for everything the woman had risked to see this through. "Thank your grandmother," Mrs. Patterson replied. "She's the one who never gave up believing that love could outwit evil, given enough time and preparation." As the FBI led her down from the fire escape, Raven looked back once at the building that had almost become her tomb. Tomorrow, she would start building the life her grandmother had died to make possible. Tonight, she was finally free. The Federal Processing Center buzzed with controlled chaos at 3 in the morning. Raven sat in a sterile interview room, a cup of terrible coffee growing cold between her hands as Agent Sarah Chen reviewed her statement for the third time. Through the reinforced glass window, she could see other agents moving with purposeful efficiency, cataloging evidence, coordinating with local law enforcement, beginning the massive undertaking of connecting Webb to decades of unsolved cases across multiple states. "We'll need you to stay available for follow-up interviews," Agent Chen said, closing the thick file folder. "Webb's associates are already talking, trying to cut deals. Your testimony will be crucial for the prosecution." Raven nodded, though the prospect of reliving tonight's events in courtrooms and depositions felt overwhelming. How many others were there? Women like me, I mean. Agent Chen's expression grew grave. "The documentation your grandmother preserved suggests at least 37 victims over the past 3 decades. We're working to identify them, notify families where possible." She paused, studying Raven's face. "You understand how significant this is? Without that evidence, Webb would have walked away from tonight. A good lawyer could have painted him as just another stalker who took things too far." But Raven's attention had drifted to the hallway beyond the window, where Carlos sat slumped in a plastic chair, ice pack pressed to his head where he'd hit the fire escape grating. His leather jacket was torn, his face pale from the taser hit, but he insisted on staying until she was finished giving her statement. "Can I go?" she asked. Agent Chen glanced at her watch. "For now. But Mrs. Patterson was right about the money in the dresser. It's legally yours. Clean inheritance, no criminal connection. You should think about what you want to do with that freedom." Freedom. The word still felt strange, like clothing that didn't quite fit yet. For 28 years, her life had been shaped by forces she didn't understand, guided by a grandmother's secret plans, stalked by a monster who saw her as unfinished business. The idea that she could simply walk out of this building and make her own choices seemed almost too radical to comprehend. She found Carlos in the hallway, and something in her chest loosened when he looked up and smiled despite everything. "How's the head?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "I'll live. More than I can say for Webb's career prospects." He shifted the ice pack, wincing slightly. The feds told me they found his studio in a warehouse on the south side. Processing equipment, photography setup, preservation chemicals, the whole sick operation laid out like a factory floor. Raven's stomach clenched. Don't. I don't want to know the details. Fair enough. Carlos reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm against her cold skin. What I do want to know is what happens now. Where do we go from here? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither of them was quite ready to explore. Everything had changed in the span of a few hours. Not just the immediate threat, but the entire foundation of who Raven thought she was. The angry young woman who'd been ready to sell her grandmother's dresser to make rent felt like a stranger now. Someone from a different life entirely. I need to see it again, she said suddenly. The apartment, the dresser, all of it. Carlos frowned. The building's still a crime scene. They won't let civilians. I'm not a civilian anymore. I'm the key witness in a federal case. She stood up, decision crystallizing as she spoke. And that's still my home, my grandmother's things. Webb doesn't get to turn my entire life into evidence. They caught a ride back to her neighborhood with a Chicago PD detective who owed Carlos a favor from his construction days. The streets looked different in the pre-dawn darkness, not because anything had physically changed, but because the weight of being hunted was finally gone. She could walk down these sidewalks without scanning for threats, enter her building without wondering if someone was watching from the shadows. The hidden drawer hung open, empty now except for dust and the lingering scent of old paper. The FBI had photographed everything in place before carefully removing each document, each photograph, each piece of evidence that would eventually put Webb away for the rest of his life. But seeing the empty space didn't feel like loss, it felt like completion. Her grandmother's 30-year mission was finished. The monster was caught. The evidence was preserved. Justice would finally come for the women who died, while Evelyn Mackenzie patiently built her trap. Raven ran her fingers along the hidden drawer's mechanism, marveling at the precision engineering that had turned her own bone structure into a key. Every measurement perfect, every pressure point calibrated to her specific touch. A love letter written in wood and metal and absolute determination. What now? Carlos asked softly. She closed the drawer, hearing the mechanism click back into place, and turned to face him. Outside, the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to touch the Chicago skyline. Now we finish what she started, Raven said. We build the life she died to make possible. The moment those words left her lips, Raven's phone buzzed with an unknown number. Carlos tensed beside her, old instincts still sharp despite Webb's capture. But something in the rhythm of the vibration felt different. Urgent, but not threatening. Ms. Mackenzie? The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. This is attorney Margaret Holbrook. I represent the Evelyn Mackenzie estate. I understand you've had quite an eventful evening. Raven sank into the chair beside her grandmother's dresser, exhaustion finally catching up to her. If you're calling about money, the FBI already cleared it. The inheritance is clean. I'm not calling about what you found tonight, Holbrook said, and something in her tone made Raven's blood run cold. I'm calling about what you haven't found yet. Your grandmother left very specific instructions to be carried out only after Webb was apprehended. There's more, Ms. Mackenzie, much more. Carlos moved closer, close enough to hear the conversation. His expression mirrored what Raven felt, a mixture of disbelief and dawning dread. How much deeper could this go? What kind of more? Raven asked. The kind that requires you to be at Graceland Cemetery in an hour. Section 15 near the Pullman Monument. Come alone and bring your grandmother's locket, the one you're wearing now. Raven's hand flew instinctively to her throat, where the small silver heart had rested since her grandmother's funeral. She'd never thought of it as anything more than a keepsake, but now, how do you know about the locket? Because your grandmother spent 5 years preparing for this conversation, and she was very thorough. Ms. Mackenzie, what you discovered tonight was just the opening move. Webb wasn't working alone, and his capture doesn't end the threat. It escalates it. The apartment seemed to tilt around her. That's impossible. The FBI has his associates. They're all talking, making deals. They have his Chicago associates, Holbrook corrected. Local muscle hired for tonight's work. But the collector network spans decades and multiple states. Webb was a franchisee, not the founder. And now that he's been exposed using your grandmother's evidence, the real architects are going to view you as an existential threat. Carlos was already shaking his head. No, absolutely not. She's not going anywhere alone, especially not to meet some mystery lawyer in a cemetery at dawn. But Raven was studying the dresser with new eyes, seeing details she'd missed in her earlier shock and adrenaline. The craftsmanship was even more intricate than she'd realized, with subtle patterns carved into the wood that seemed almost like instructions or a map. The locket isn't just jewelry, she said slowly, understanding flooding through her. It's another key. Your grandmother always said you were quick, Holbrook confirmed. The cemetery meeting isn't optional, Ms. Mackenzie. The people Webb reported to are already mobilizing. They know their operation is compromised, which means they're shifting to damage control mode. You have perhaps 6 hours before they decide the simplest solution is to eliminate all remaining evidence, including you. The weight of her pregnancy felt heavier suddenly, the responsibility of protecting not just herself, but the life growing inside her. What exactly did my grandmother set in motion? Something that required 30 years of patience and preparation. Something that needed Webb to be captured alive so the network would reveal itself trying to silence him. Your grandmother didn't just build a trap for one monster, Ms. Mackenzie. She built a trap for the entire system that created him. Raven looked around the apartment that had been her sanctuary and her prison, at the man who'd stood by her through impossible revelations, at the dresser that had held secrets within secrets. Everything she thought she'd understood about her situation was shifting again, expanding into something larger and more dangerous than she'd imagined possible. The final test, she whispered, remembering something her grandmother used to say during their self-defense sessions. Not the last test, but the ultimate one, the moment when all preparation either proved sufficient or catastrophically inadequate. Exactly, Holbrook said, as if she'd been listening to Raven's thoughts. Everything until now has been preparation. The real work starts in 57 minutes. Carlos grabbed her hand. You don't have to do this. We can run, disappear, start over somewhere else. But even as he said it, Raven could see in his eyes that he understood the futility. There was no running from something this vast, this patient, this thorough. Her grandmother had known that, had planned for it, had spent 3 decades building toward this moment when Raven would have to choose between hiding forever and finishing what had been started. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the locket against her chest, and made the choice her grandmother had always known she would make. Tell me where to go, she said into the phone, and tell me what I'm really walking into. The coordinates led Raven deeper into Graceland Cemetery than she'd ever ventured, past the familiar monuments into a section where morning fog clung to weathered headstones like whispered secrets. The Pullman Monument loomed ahead, its granite angels seeming to watch her approach with stone eyes that reflected the pale dawn light. She'd left Carlos at the cemetery gates despite his furious protests. Some battles, she'd realized, had to be fought alone, not from bravery but from necessity. Her grandmother's plan, whatever it encompassed, had been designed around one person carrying it forward. Adding Carlos would only create variables that 30 years of preparation couldn't account for. The locket felt warm against her skin as she approached Section 15, its familiar weight now charged with new significance. How many times had her grandmother touched this same piece of silver while planning for this moment? How many sleepless nights had she spent calculating angles and contingencies, building layers upon layers of protection for a granddaughter who might not even be her blood? Ms. Mackenzie. The voice came from behind a massive oak tree, and Raven turned to see a woman in her 50s emerge from the shadows. Margaret Holbrook looked exactly like what casting would order for a high-powered attorney, sharp suit, sharper eyes, and an aura of controlled intelligence that reminded Raven uncomfortably of her grandmother. You came alone. Good. That suggests you understand the gravity of what we're dealing with. What I understand, Raven replied, is that I'm tired of being manipulated by people who think they know better than I do about my own life." Holbrook smiled, and it was neither warm nor cold, merely appreciative, like a teacher acknowledging a student's progress. "Your grandmother warned me you'd resist the paternalistic approach. She was quite specific about treating you as an equal partner, not a protected asset. Then start talking to me like one." "Very well." Holbrook pulled out a tablet, its screen showing what appeared to be a real-time map dotted with moving red indicators. "These are vehicles converging on Chicago from 5 different states. Webb's capture triggered automated protocols we've been monitoring for years. The network is mobilizing to contain the damage." Raven studied the display, counting at least a dozen indicators moving toward the city. "How long do we have?" "They'll be in position by noon." But that's not the immediate problem. Holbrook swiped to a new screen showing surveillance footage from outside Raven's apartment building. This was recorded 20 minutes ago. The black SUV parked across from her building looked innocuous enough, but Raven could see the subtle positioning that spoke of professional surveillance. Someone was already watching her home, waiting for her to return. "Local advance team," Holbrook explained. "Their job is to maintain visual contact while the primary units establish a perimeter." Classic containment protocol. Containment for what? For the systematic elimination of everyone connected to last night's operation. Webb, his immediate associates, the FBI agents who arrested him, Mrs. Patterson, Carlos. Holbrook paused meaningfully. "And you." The weight of her pregnancy seemed to double as the full scope of the threat crystallized. These people weren't just coming for her, they were coming for everyone she cared about, everyone who knew the truth about what her grandmother had uncovered. "The locket," Raven said, her hand moving instinctively to her throat. "You said it's a key to the final phase of your grandmother's plan." Holbrook gestured toward the Pullman monument. "The evidence you found in the dresser was meant to capture Webb. But Evelyn knew that would only be the beginning. She spent the last 5 years of her life building something much more comprehensive." They walked together toward the monument's base, where Raven could now see a small bronze plaque she'd never noticed before. The inscription looked like standard memorial text, but as they got closer, she realized certain letters were slightly raised, forming a pattern that matched the shape of her locket's backing. "She turned you into more than bait," Holbrook continued. "She turned you into a weapon, not just against Webb but against the entire network. Every move they make to neutralize you will trigger responses they can't anticipate, reveal connections they thought were hidden." Raven pressed the locket against the plaque, feeling the mechanism click into place with the same precision as the dresser's hidden drawer. A section of the monument's base slid away, revealing a waterproof container that had been waiting in the Chicago earth for years. Inside were documents that made the dresser's contents look preliminary: financial records, communication intercepts, photographs of people in suits shaking hands with people in shadows. The architecture of a conspiracy that stretched back decades and reached into levels of power that made Webb look like a small-time predator. "This is what she was really hunting," Holbrook said. "Not one killer, but the system that creates them, protects them, profits from them." Raven stared at the evidence in her hands, understanding finally dawning. Her grandmother hadn't just been tracking a serial killer. She'd been documenting a network that treated human trafficking and murder as a business model. And now that business was coming to collect its debts. "Tell me how to finish this," Raven said. "First," Holbrook replied, "we keep you alive long enough to see it through." The answer came in a form Raven never expected. A choice that would require her to sacrifice the one thing she'd fought hardest to protect. "The network's weakness is the same as its strength," Holbrook explained, pulling up another screen on her tablet. "They've spent decades building a system where every component is compartmentalized, isolated, protected. But that also means when one section is exposed, they'll sacrifice everything connected to it to preserve the whole." Raven studied the documents from the monument, seeing names she recognized from news broadcasts, faces from political rallies, signatures on legislation that had shaped her entire life. The scope was breathtaking and nauseating. "My grandmother knew this would happen," she said slowly. She knew capturing Webb would trigger a larger response. She counted on it. The evidence you're holding is worthless without corroboration. Just one old woman's obsessive documentation that any defense attorney could dismiss as paranoid fantasy. But when they come for you, when they activate their protection protocols, they'll confirm every connection she made. The pieces click together with awful clarity. She made me the trigger. More than that, she made you the proof. Holbrook's expression softened slightly, but she also knew what it would cost. The only way to expose this network is to let them reveal themselves by trying to eliminate the threat. And right now, you are that threat. Raven's hand moved to her stomach, to the life growing inside her that had already survived so much. The irony was devastating. She'd discovered she was pregnant on the same night she'd learned her entire existence was planned by someone else. Now that accidental miracle was about to become another casualty of her grandmother's war. "There's another way," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she could see in Holbrook's face that there wasn't. "Your grandmother explored every alternative. Believe me, she spent 5 years trying to find a path that didn't require this level of sacrifice. But they're too careful, too protected, too patient. They'll only expose themselves if the threat is immediate and existential." The morning air felt colder suddenly, cutting through her leather jacket like ice. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Walk into the trap they're setting. Let them think they're succeeding. Allow them to reveal the full extent of their reach as they try to contain the damage." Holbrook paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried genuine regret. "Knowing that you might not survive the process." The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of Chicago waking up, unaware that a decision made in this cemetery would determine how many monsters continued to walk among them. Raven thought about the women in those photographs, about lives stolen and families destroyed, about a system that treated human beings as commodities to be harvested. She thought about her grandmother, spending 30 years building toward this moment, sacrificing her own life to create the possibility of justice. And she thought about the child she carried, who deserved to grow up in a world where predators couldn't hide behind wealth and power and institutional protection. "If I do this," Raven said finally, "what happens to Carlos, to Mrs. Patterson, to everyone who helped me? They become secondary targets instead of primary ones. Still at risk, but not the immediate focus. The network will concentrate their resources on eliminating you first, which gives us time to move the others to safety. And after? If I somehow survive this? If you survive, you'll have evidence that no court in the world can ignore. Video, audio, documented communications, everything needed to bring down not just Webb's handlers, but the entire infrastructure they've built." Raven closed her eyes, feeling the weight of choice settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her grandmother had carried this same weight for decades, had made the decision to sacrifice her own peace for the possibility of justice. Now that legacy, that responsibility, that terrible gift was passing to her. When she opened her eyes, Holbrook was watching her with something that might have been pride. "She knew you'd say yes," the lawyer said quietly, "even knowing the cost, even knowing what you'd be giving up. She said you had too much of her stubbornness to let them win through intimidation. When do we start?" "We already have. The moment you opened that container, it sent a signal to monitoring stations across the country. They know you've accessed the final cache of evidence. They know the clock is running." Raven looked down at the documents in her hands, at 30 years of meticulous investigation and patient planning, at the architecture of evil laid out in devastating detail. The morning sun was rising higher now, burning off the fog, illuminating the path forward with crystalline clarity. "Then let's finish what she started," Raven said, and felt something fundamental shift inside her, the final transformation from victim to weapon, from hunted to hunter. The sacrifice was made. The trap was set. Now all that remained was to spring it. The first sign that the trap was working came 6 hours later. Raven sat in the FBI's downtown field office, surrounded by agents whose names she was already forgetting, watching surveillance feeds that showed her empty apartment building from 12 different angles. The black SUV was gone, but it had been replaced by something worse: nothing. Complete absence of watchers, which meant they'd moved to active phase. They pulled back at 2 p.m., Agent Sarah Chen explained, pointing to timestamps on the monitors. Classic pattern when surveillance shifts to strike preparation. They're regrouping. Holbrook stood behind them, her tablet now connected to the FBI's systems, streaming real-time intelligence that made even the seasoned agents look unsettled. The red dots on her map had stopped moving toward Chicago and started forming perimeter positions around specific locations: the cemetery, the apartment building, the diner where Raven worked, even the hospital where she'd had her pregnancy confirmed. "They know her entire routine," Carlos said from the corner where he'd been pacing for the last hour. "How is that possible?" 30 years of patience," Raven answered, her hand still unconsciously moving to her stomach. The baby hadn't started showing yet, but she felt its presence like a secret weight, a future that might never exist. "They've been watching my grandmother watch them. They probably know things about my life that I don't remember." The thought should have been terrifying, but instead, Raven felt something she'd never experienced before: the cold clarity of purpose. Her grandmother's training had been preparing her for this moment when emotion became liability and calculation became survival. Every self-defense lesson, every lecture about reading people, every warning about trusting too easily had been building toward these next few hours. "The communications intercepts are already paying off," Agent Chen continued, pulling up another screen. 3 separate cell towers picked up encrypted traffic spiking right after you opened that container. We're tracking at least 15 distinct handlers coordinating movements across 4 states. Holbrook smiled, and Raven recognized the expression from her grandmother's face during chess games, the moment when a long-planned strategy finally began to unfold. They're not just responding to Raven as a threat, they're treating her like a virus that might have contaminated their entire system. Which means they're activating protocols they've kept hidden for decades. Through the window, Raven could see Chicago's skyline stretching toward Lake Michigan, millions of people going about their lives while monsters moved among them with institutional protection. How many other women like those in the photographs had disappeared into this system? How many families had spent years wondering what happened to daughters who were never coming home? "There's something else," Agent Chen said, her voice dropping. "We've been monitoring Webb since his arrest. He made a phone call an hour ago. The recording was brief, but devastating. Webb's voice, calm and controlled despite his circumstances, speaking to someone whose responses were filtered through obvious voice distortion. The Chicago asset is fully activated. Recommend immediate harvest protocols before federal contamination spreads." The response chilled Raven's blood. Authorized. Clean sweep operational. No survivors, no evidence, no complications. Carlos stopped pacing. "No survivors? They're talking about killing everyone?" "Not everyone," Holbrook corrected grimly. "They're talking about eliminating the entire Chicago cell to prevent it from exposing the larger network. That means Webb, his local associates, any FBI agents involved in the arrest. Mrs. Patterson," she looked directly at Raven, "and anyone who accessed your grandmother's evidence." The weight of responsibility settled heavier on Raven's shoulders. Her decision to open those hidden drawers hadn't just put herself at risk. It had marked everyone she cared about for death. The network was willing to sacrifice an entire city's worth of operations to protect their larger system. "How long before they move?" she asked. "Based on the traffic patterns, we estimate they'll be in position by nightfall," Agent Chen replied. "Multiple teams, military-style coordination, probably federal-level resources. This isn't going to look like a criminal operation. It's going to look like a terrorist response." Raven stood up, feeling the familiar weight of her leather jacket, the silver locket warm against her skin. Her grandmother's ghost seemed to hover in the room, 30 years of preparation condensing into this moment of truth. Every choice led here, to a pregnant woman in a government building about to walk into hell because it was the only way to drag the devils into the light. "Then we don't wait for nightfall," she said. "We force them to move before they're ready." Holbrook's smile widened. "What did you have in mind?" "Something my grandmother taught me about fighting monsters," Raven replied, feeling the final transformation complete itself inside her chest. Sometimes the only way to kill them is to let them think they're eating you. The trap wasn't just set anymore. It was about to be sprung. The plan was elegantly simple in its brutality. Raven would return to her apartment building, alone, carrying a briefcase full of her grandmother's evidence. She would walk into the trap they were setting, let them think they were succeeding, while every second was recorded by devices so small the FBI techs had to show her twice where they were hidden. "Remember," Agent Chen said as they made final preparations, "your job isn't to fight them. Your job is to stay alive long enough for them to incriminate themselves." Raven adjusted the nearly invisible wire threaded through her leather jacket, feeling its alien presence against her skin. "And if staying alive isn't an option, then you make sure they reveal as much as possible before—" Chen didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The ride back to her neighborhood felt like traveling through a membrane between worlds. The FBI surveillance van dropped her 3 blocks away, close enough to provide backup, but far enough to maintain the illusion that she was walking into their web unprotected. As Raven made her way down the familiar streets, briefcase heavy in her hand, she could feel eyes tracking her movement from windows, doorways, parked cars that hadn't been there that morning. Her apartment building looked exactly the same: crumbling brick facade, broken security door, the smell of industrial disinfectant barely masking decades of urban decay. But now Raven could see it through her grandmother's eyes, could read the subtle signs of surveillance and preparation that had been invisible to her before. The man reading a newspaper on the stoop across the street wasn't a neighbor. The utility van parked at the corner had been there too long, its panels positioned to provide sight lines on every exit. Mrs. Patterson's apartment was dark, which meant the FBI had already moved her to a safe house. Carlos was secured in a hotel downtown, furious at being sidelined but alive. The people she cared about were protected, which left Raven free to do what needed to be done. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway was empty but charged with tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Her door was exactly as she'd left it, but when she put her key in the lock, she could feel the subtle wrongness that meant someone had been inside, waiting. The apartment was dark except for the pale winter light filtering through windows she hadn't bothered to cover with curtains. Raven set the briefcase on her grandmother's dresser, the piece of furniture that had started everything, that had hidden 30 years of secrets until the right moment arrived. "You can come out now," she said to the empty room. "We both know why I'm here." The response came from her kitchen. Footsteps, careful but confident, belonging to someone who had been watching and waiting and planning. When the figure emerged from the shadows, Raven felt a shock of recognition that had nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with the cold intelligence in those eyes. Ms. Mackenzie. The woman was middle-aged, professionally dressed, carrying herself with the same controlled authority as Holbrook, but radiating something far more dangerous. "Thank you for making this simple. Your grandmother would have appreciated the efficiency. You knew her." "I recruited her, actually, back when we thought she could be useful, before she developed philosophical differences with our operational methods." The woman moved closer, and Raven could see others emerging from her bedroom, her bathroom, spaces where they'd been waiting like spiders in a web. She was quite brilliant at finding things people preferred to keep hidden. Unfortunately, she lacked the vision to understand why some things should stay hidden. Raven's hand moved instinctively toward her stomach, toward the life she was carrying that represented hope and future, and everything these people sought to destroy. "Because you profit from the hiding. We provide stability. Order. The world is full of predators, Ms. Mackenzie. We simply ensure that their activities don't disrupt larger social structures." Webb and his associates serve important functions in their communities: business leaders, political donors, civic institutions. Their personal hobbies, regrettable as they might be, are a small price to pay for the stability they provide. The casual dismissal of murder and trafficking as personal hobbies sent rage burning through Raven's chest. But she forced herself to remain calm. Every word was being recorded, every admission building the case that would finally bring justice. "My grandmother didn't see it that way," Your grandmother was an idealist. She believed in justice over order, righteousness over pragmatism. She spent 30 years building toward a moment that would destabilize carefully maintained systems. The woman smiled, and it was colder than the Chicago winter outside. But she made one crucial error in her planning, which was, she assumed you'd inherited her conviction. But you're not your grandmother, are you? You're not even her granddaughter. You're just another victim we've allowed to live longer than most. The woman gestured, and Raven heard the quiet click of weapons being readied. The question now is whether you'll die quietly, or whether we'll need to make this unpleasant. Raven felt the final pieces of her old life falling away, leaving behind something harder and more dangerous than anything her grandmother could have trained her to become. She was no longer the scared, pregnant woman who discovered terrible secrets. She was the weapon those secrets had forged. "There's a third option," she said, and smiled with her grandmother's cold precision. "You could try to kill me and find out what happens next." The trap snapped shut around all of them. The woman's confident smile faltered as tactical lights flooded the apartment from every window. The sound of shattering glass mixed with shouted federal commands as FBI agents repelled through Raven's windows while others breached the front door with explosive charges that shook the entire building. Federal agents, weapons down, hands visible. The next 30 seconds unfolded like a choreographed dance of violence and surrender. The woman who had spoken so casually about murder tried to reach for something inside her jacket but found herself face down on Raven's kitchen floor before her hand moved 6 inches. Her associates, caught in a crossfire of federal agents and tactical lights, chose survival over loyalty with the speed of professional operators who understood when a mission had failed. Raven pressed herself against her grandmother's dresser, feeling the baby flutter inside her as adrenaline coursed through her system. Agent Chen appeared at her side, checking for injuries while other agents secured the scene with military precision. "Are you hurt?" Chen asked, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. "I'm okay." Raven's voice sounded steadier than she felt. "We got it all?" "Every word. Conspiracy, racketeering, accessory to murder, obstruction of justice. We have enough to dismantle their entire network." Chen helped her to her feet as the arrested woman was dragged past them, no longer projecting authority but looking like what she had always been, a predator whose protection had finally been stripped away. The woman's eyes met Raven's as the agents hauled her toward the door. "You have no idea what you've destroyed," she snarled. "The chaos you've unleashed." "Good," Raven replied, and meant it. 3 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Raven's new apartment, a real apartment in a better neighborhood, paid for with reward money from a federal government grateful for evidence that had already led to 47 arrests across 12 states. She stood in the kitchen, watching coffee brew while her hand rested on the gentle curve of her belly, feeling the steady flutter of life inside her. The newspaper on her counter carried the latest headline, "Federal Trafficking Ring Trials Begin, Key Witness Testimony Continues." She didn't need to read the article. She had lived every word of the testimony, had spent weeks in courtrooms watching powerful people try to explain away decades of protected predation. Webb had died in federal custody, officially a suicide, though Raven suspected his former associates had reached him first. His death had actually strengthened the case, triggering panic among his network that led to mistakes, desperate communications, and ultimately, more arrests. Carlos knocked on her door at exactly 8 o'clock, carrying fresh pastries from the bakery where he now worked. The diner had closed after its owner was arrested as part of the secondary investigation. But Carlos had found something better, a place that appreciated his skills and didn't ask questions about his past. "How are my 2 favorite people?" he asked, setting breakfast on her table and looking meaningfully at her expanding waistline. "Growing," she said, accepting his hug. "Doctor says everything looks perfect. And the nightmares?" "Getting better." This was mostly true. The dreams still came sometimes. Visions of her grandmother's investigation, of women who hadn't been saved, of the life she had lived unknowing of its larger purpose. But they were balanced now by other dreams. A child learning to walk, a future built on truth instead of lies, a world marginally safer because monsters could no longer hide behind institutional protection. Mrs. Patterson arrived 20 minutes later, as she did every Tuesday and Friday, bringing homemade soup and medical advice and the kind of grandmotherly attention Raven was learning to accept. The old nurse had become fierce in her protectiveness, having decided that anyone brave enough to walk into hell for justice deserved proper care during pregnancy. "You're looking strong," Mrs. Patterson announced, settling her considerable presence into Raven's kitchen chair. "That baby's lucky to have such a fighter for a mother." Raven touched the silver locket at her throat, the one piece of her grandmother she had kept. Inside was a new photograph, not the image of the woman who had raised her, but an ultrasound picture of her daughter, because the baby was a girl, and Raven had already decided on her name. "I've been thinking," she said to her assembled family, the brother she had chosen and the grandmother she had found, about what comes next. The FBI had offered her a position as a consultant, helping to identify other networks, other systems of protected predation. Holbrook's legal foundation wanted her to speak publicly, to put a human face on the fight against organized trafficking. Universities had invited her to share her grandmother's research, to help train the next generation of investigators. All worthy causes, all important work. But Raven had spent 28 years living someone else's plan for her life, and she was finally ready to write her own story. "I want to open a shelter," she said, "for women who need to disappear, who need protection while they rebuild their lives, somewhere safe, somewhere funded well enough that they don't have to choose between safety and survival." Carlos smiled with the same pride her grandmother might have shown. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. Outside, Chicago hummed with the energy of 10 million people going about their lives in a world that was fractionally more just than it had been 6 months ago. Raven's daughter kicked against her ribs, impatient to join a world her mother was still improving, and for the first time since opening that hidden drawer, Raven Mackenzie felt something she had never experienced before: peace. The trap had been sprung. The monsters had been caught. The future was hers to build,